Hey everyone, welcome to Slurs and Stereotypes. I'm Adam, and the focus of our lecture today is on hate speech. In the last few lectures, we've been considering slurs and the phenomena of linguistic reappropriation in order to appreciate the complexity of the phenomena under investigation for the course. So this course is focusing on slurs and stereotypes. So one of the important things that we want to do in the course is appreciate the full range or variety of slurs and stereotypes. So in the last few lectures, we've just appreciated the variety of usages that slurs have, including their paradigm derogatory use, as well as their reappropriative use by in-group members. This is important, at least for two purposes. One, it helps us to appreciate the phenomena under investigation, for instance, slurs. But secondly, it helps to give you an idea of the different types of research projects that you can undertake in the course and in the field more generally. All right. So on the one hand, of course, we can study hate speech and the use of slurs in an offensive, derogatory manner. And we can seek to better understand the effects of hate speech on targets. But also, I wanted to highlight that another active area of research, especially in the last several years, has been the reappropriative use of slurs or slur reclamation. Okay, so since that's a really hot topic in the field right now, I thought that it would be valuable for you as emerging scholars, as emerging cognitive scientists, to have some early exposure to this work. Who knows, you might be the next leading scholar in the field on this topic. So I wanted you to get a flavor of slurs, both in the derogatory, dehumanizing sense, as well as in the context of reclamation, because you might be interested in either focus for your research project, final paper, final presentation, future work. Okay. So now that had a nice we've had a nice introduction to slurs, both in the derogatory offensive sense as well as in the reappropriative in-group sense. What we'll focus on today is slurs as hate speech. Okay, so we'll sort of go back to the traditional understanding of slurs or the paradigm usage, slurs as hate speech. The focus of today will be to investigate what's unique about slurs, right? So if I call you a racial or ethnic slur, or I call you an insult that targets you not based on your group status, but based on individual characteristics, for example, your weight, right? Is one more offensive than the other? Are individual level insults more or less or equally offensive as group-based insults, right? That's an interesting question. Are we more offended by individualized insults, like something that targets me, as Adam, or are we more offended by insults that target me as a group member, right? As me as an Asian American, for example. Okay, so that's one of the questions that we're gonna investigate in this article for today. Another question that we're going to investigate is what's worse, a linguistic insult or petty theft, like a non-linguistic sort of deviation from a social norm, right? So we'll ask, what do people consider to be deserving of more punishment? If someone uses a slur, right, that's not good. So perhaps we ought to punish that person for slurring a target. But also, petty theft is not good either. So perhaps we need to punish the person that engages in petty theft. The question is, which one's worse? Is petty theft worse? Is someone that uses a slur towards a target worse? Or are they equally as bad? We're going to focus on these questions in the lecture for today. Okay. Also, one more note before we dive into the article, sort of just the way that the lectures are structured. Each lecture is going to focus on one or two main readings, but rather than just summarizing some facts for you, right? Like here's 10 facts about the article, right? Instead of just giving you facts to remember, we're going to practice reading through the articles and understanding purpose. And I just stated the purpose of this article, like the main research questions we're going to address. Then we're going to look at the methods. How was this research carried out? What were the exact steps and tools used to carry out this study? And then finally, results. What were the results that popped out after we applied the methods in this study? Okay, the reason why we need to sort of go through articles through each lecture and understand the purpose, methods, and results of each article is because this is going to be the path, this is going to be the way that we become better equipped to do our own research. And ultimately, that's the important thing, is we want to learn how to be cognitive scientists, not just memorize what other cognitive scientists have done, right? We're at Berkeley, we're here to do work, right? Original work, and not just sort of, oh, here's 200 facts about slurs and stereotypes, and that's what I did for the course, okay? So the goal of the course is not to memorize like 200 facts about slurs and stereotypes, although that might be helpful and contribute to your knowledge of the field, right? But that's not the end game. That's not the goal, right? We're really learning about slurs and stereotypes in the service of engaging in original research. Okay, that's why we do quizzes, to check our knowledge. Is not because that's an end in itself, right? Oh, you know 200 facts about slurs and stereotypes. Good job. But rather, we want to learn enough about the field so that we can apply and engage in our own research and publish a paper, ideally, right? Provide a presentation or publish a paper. Okay, and so that's the end goal in mind, and why we're structuring the lectures and the readings in the way that we're doing. Okay, if you think about it, this is the most practical task, right? This is the most practical way to orient ourselves, because if you're thinking about going to graduate school and earning a PhD, the way you earn a PhD is not by passing an exam, right? Like passing a quiz with 500 questions and then boom, you get your PhD, right? But rather, in order to get your PhD, you're going to spend years reading articles, reading relevant research findings, right? Reading about methodologies, and then tinkering and troubleshooting, engaging in some trial and error, right? And discussing this with your colleagues, and then building up towards a project that you can execute and complete, and then write up the results. Okay, so to get a PhD, we want to complete research projects, right? Which require knowing some things, some facts, but using those facts to then carry out our own original research. Okay, so the best way to understand how to execute your own project is to go through many instances, many good examples of excellent research. And so one of my purposes as your instructor in the course is to help select some excellent articles that serve as good examples. Okay, this is going to be one article that we can use as an example for how to conduct research on the impact of hate speech on students. Okay, so that's what we're going to focus on today. And just to refresh your memory, the purpose of the article for today by Boakman and Liu 2002 is to investigate the perceptions of hate speech or the usage of slurs, and to understand whether group-based slurs or group-based hate speech insults are more or less or equally as offensive as individual level insults, for example, based on your weight status. Okay, this might also give us a interesting criteria for what counts as a slur, right? If we get different results for hate speech directed at group status, and we get certain results for group status slurs or insults, but we get different results for individual level insults, then that gives us a criteria for suggesting that, you know what, like the N word or the C word as a slur, those are a different type, or these function slightly differently than other types of words, like those that target your individual level features. Okay, so one goal for the article is to understand how individual level insults may differ from group level insults. Another purpose of this article is to determine whether verbal insults are more or less or equally deserving of punishment as petty theft, like non-linguistic offenses. Okay, so now that we have like a research question, we have some questions that we want to investigate. Let's look at this article by Boakman and Liu and see how they addressed these questions and came up with some results. Okay, this article is titled Hate Speech, Asian American Students' Justice Judgments and Psychological Responses, published in the Journal of Social Issues in 2002. All right, so in experiment 1, this experiment's going to focus on the first question, research question that I introduced, and that was, what's going on with insults, right? We have lots of different types of insults. I can insult you based on your ethnic status or on your weight, for example. I would never do that, but I could, right? And people in society do insult each other on these, based on these criteria. Okay, so the goal for experiment 1 is to better understand this issue. Okay, what's worse, calling someone overweight or calling someone a slur, a group-based slur, ethnic slur? So to address this question empirically, right, rather than just writing my own subjective opinion about the issue, when we engage in experimental social psychology, we want to utilize participants. Okay, so for this study, 50 participants were recruited, and all the participants in the study for today, the studies for today, are going to be Asian American students from university. Okay, the average age was about 20 years old, 76% female participants. Okay, and the participants were presented with different scenarios. Okay, and so this is going to be very common in social psychology, is we'll have a group of participants and then we'll provide the participants with different scenarios to get their judgments of what's going on in the scenario. Okay, and usually what we want to do is we want to have scenarios that are almost identical in their content. For example, it might be a newspaper clipping, right? Like a mock newspaper clipping where the newspaper clipping from both scenarios are identical, but the insult in newspaper A is like the N-word, whereas the insult in newspaper B is like a insult for overweight status, right? And then that way we know that since the newspapers are identical and only differ based on that single insult, then we know that if there's systematically different responses from the participants to those different scenarios, right, then we know that they differ in their responses to those scenarios. Okay, so if I have 50 participants, then I can have them evaluate a newspaper that has an ethnic slur, and then another almost identical newspaper that uses like an overweight based slur instead. And then based on the participants' responses, we can see like if in general, they tend to see the ethnic slur as more offensive, less offensive, or equally as offensive as the slur that targets individuals based on their weight status. Okay, and this is helpful to know because lots of social psychology studies are done in this way. Okay, and you know what you could do, like as we're working through the article, I want you to be thinking like, how could we tinker with this to extend this study, to replicate and extend the study in a different way? Okay, and so one thing that we could do is, based on the stimuli that we're going to look at right here, we might switch out the ethnic slurs for Asian Americans and African Americans with, for example, slurs that target Mexican Americans or Italian Americans or just some other ethnic group. Or we might, instead of focusing on ethnic slurs, we might focus on gender or sexual orientation based slurs, right? And so that's what we can do to pump out new articles and further contribute to the field. We have to think about what's being studied here, what has been focused on in existing research, and then replicate the methodology to another group or to another topic that has not yet been focused on. Okay, and this will just help us have more comprehensive knowledge of how ethnic slurs work, how sex-based slurs work, and so on for all the slurs that we will eventually study, okay, systematically. Okay. All right. So the participants were presented with different scenarios, and the nature of the insult varied, like I mentioned, across the different newspapers. In one scenario focused on overweight status or the weight status. In another scenario, it focused on ethnic identity or ethnic group status, but Asian American group status. And then the third scenario focused on ethnic status once again, but this time African American status. Okay. So one individual characteristic and then two group-based characteristics, but the group-based characteristics differed. One was Asian Americans and another was African Americans. And this is an idea of how the scenario is constructed. Okay. The scenario describes several people standing in line at a grocery store, right? They're in line waiting to pay for their items. The target of the insult, right, the person that's being slurred in this scenario, is delaying the line by realizing they don't have enough money to pay for their purchase. Okay, so you can imagine there's a person that's trying to pay at the front of the line, but they don't have enough money, right? This is going to be the eventual target. Okay, in the overweight condition, right? So this is a general part of the scenario, and then this is where we get a little bit of variation depending on whether we're in the overweight condition, Asian American condition, or African American condition. Okay, and what we mean by those three different conditions is that in each condition, for example, in the overweight condition, this is going to be the case where the newspaper or the verbal scenario is focusing on the insult based on weight. Okay, the Asian American condition has the insult focusing on ethnic status as an Asian American, and the African American condition is going to be the condition that focuses on the status as an African American. Okay, and so the way that this is presented in this scenario is in the overweight condition, one of the people waiting in line says to the individual that doesn't have enough money to pay at the front, "What a effing fat a-hole." Okay. And then in the Asian American condition, I won't say the slurs over YouTube over this lecture, but you can go ahead and read it in the lecture slides. Okay. In the Asian American condition, one of the people waiting in line says to the target, "What a effing C word." And in the African American condition, one of the people waiting in line says to the target, "What a effing N word." Okay. And you see that these are similarly structured. What a effing. And then we have the insult that's based on either weight status, ethnic status as an Asian American, or ethnic status as an African American. Okay. And if you wanted to create a replication and an extension, then what you would do is instead of what a effing C word or N word, you could replace something else like what a effing, think of a slur that targets Mexican Americans or Italian Americans, so on. Okay. Next, when the target of the insult makes a nonverbal surprise response, the person continues by shouting a more extensive degrading insult. Okay. So the target, after this first sort of insult, right after the target in the front of the line makes a surprise response, here the insulter, the person launching the insults, continues with even more insults. Okay. In the overweight condition, it's just going to be a continuation of the insult based on weight status, an individual level characteristic. So in the overweight condition, the person says, "I hate you. You fat a-hole. You are forever holding up the entire line. If you didn't bring enough cash, you shouldn't come into the store at all. Go back home." Okay. In the Asian American condition, the person says, quote, "I hate you. All you C words are forever holding up the entire line. If you didn't bring enough cash, you shouldn't come into the store at all. Go back home." And finally, in the African American condition, the person says, quote, "I hate you. all you N-words are forever holding up the entire line. If you didn't bring enough cash, you shouldn't come into the store at all. Go back home. Okay, so again, notice that structurally, the linguistic scenario is identical across these three conditions. We've just systematically swapped out the insult, right? Fat a-hole for C-word for N-word, okay? And another thing you can think about here is whether you like these scenarios, whether you think they're appropriate, whether you think they could be improved upon, right? The function of these scenarios is to provide a context in which we can interpret the offensiveness of these insults, okay? We might try other contexts, maybe not at the store, but also at the university or among friends. And, by systematically modifying not just the type of insult, but also the context, this might be another way in which you can further replicate and extend this type of work. All right, so now that we have scenarios, and we're going to have participants responding to scenarios like, that's super offensive. I don't like these scenarios that I'm reading here, right? Well, what we need to do is we need to measure how offensive, these insults are, okay? In other words, we need some measures to quantify our results, okay? So how do we come up with measures? Well, one of the best things to do, an ideal thing to do, is to utilize measures that have already been utilized in existing research. And one thing you'll notice is that across, like for example, in slur research, you'll see that similar measures are used, right? Just to sort of maintain consistency in the field, okay? So if Scholar A uses this societal impact scale to measure the impact of this behavior on society, well, then in my future study that is sort of replicating and extending Scholar A's work, I'll reuse that same scale, right? That way we know that my results are similar and sort of speaking in the same terms as Scholar A's research. If I'm using a different scale for the measurement of impact of a behavior than Scholar A did, then my different results may be a function or an outcome of my different scale and not of a function of different behaviors, right? So that's what we want to do is in an area of research that has been done before, right? We've already seen research done by Raman, by Galinsky and colleagues, and so on. If we want to engage in their type of work, like Raman's work or Galinsky's work, then a great thing to do would be to utilize some of their similar measures, okay, insofar as we take those to be adequate, okay? We may, at some point, challenge the measures, and there are articles and there are researchers that sort of what their goal is not to use a measure to find a result, like how impactful are slurs, different insults using this measure. Some scholars don't use a measure to find a result, but focus on building measures, right? Sort of like providing measurement tools, validating those measurement tools, and so on, okay? So the purpose of this article is not to provide an original measurement tool, but to use a measurement tool that has already been provided in the literature, okay? And then this article is going to use the societal impact scale for one of its measurements. And if you're going to measure the impact of harm, right, if you are interested in one of your studies, right, if you're interested in measuring the extent of harm or the impact of harm, then one thing you can do is not only cite this work by Boakman and Liu, but also use the measures that they used, okay? And then you can compare how your results are similar or different from their results using the same measurement. So in experiment 1, the way that they measured the extent of harm was with the societal impact scale, okay? And what I've done here is I've provided you with a citation to where you can find the scale, okay? So this was provided in Boakman's doctoral dissertation in 1996, And check it out. Boakman also earned the PhD from UC Berkeley, right? Our cherished home institution. Okay. So that's sort of where this scale comes from. Okay. And Boakman's going to use this scale, right, in this article to measure the extent of harm. The scale is composed. So if you're asking, okay, what is a scale? Like, what's it look like? What does it do? The scale is composed of 6 items. Okay. And by items, we mean sort of like questions, right? So question 1, question 2, and I'll give some examples. Okay. Here in like a minute. Okay. But it has 6 items, 6 questions where you're going to rate your agreement or disagreement with that question or statement. Okay. One question will be like, do you like puppies? Not for this societal impact scale, but, if you're going to have a scale for, non-human companions, your likeliness to adopt pets, you might have a scale, right? Where there's 6 items. One of the items will ask you, do you love dogs? And there might be and if you rate highly on that, right, then that indicates that you are likely to get along with pets or non-human animals. And if you rate it low, right, then that indicates that you won't get along with animals. Okay. So we can create scales to measure really any sort of type of impact. And when we're creating those scales, we just want to come up or derive the appropriate questions that would measure that phenomenon. Okay. Some sample items from this societal impact scale. One item, the harm in a case like this is widespread. Do you agree or disagree with that on the scale where rating a 1 would be strongly disagree with that statement, and 6 would be strongly agree with that statement? Okay, so the lower end will be disagreement, higher end will be agreement. Okay, and here, if you rate a 6, you strongly agree with the statement, the harm in a case like this is widespread. This is positively scored to indicate that the harm in this case, right, has wide societal impact, okay, or it's measuring a larger extent of the harm from this kind of phenomena. Okay. We have some items on a scale that are positively scored, but some are reverse or negatively scored. Okay, so an example of an item that would be reverse or negatively scored would be this. In a case like this, the harm done primarily affects specific individuals. Okay, and here we see that this contrasts with the question or item right above it, where here the first question or item suggested that the harm is widespread. And then the second item, we see that it's saying that the effects of the harm are at the individual level rather than being widespread, right? So we see that this is asking sort of like an opposite question. And here we see that a low score on this second question, right, like a 1, would indicate a higher or larger extent of harm. Okay, so for a positively scored item, higher score, 6, would indicate more harm. And on this negatively scored item, the second one, a lower score, 1, would indicate a larger extent or more widespread harm. Okay, and it's helpful sometimes. We can debate about this in methods sections, but oftentimes researchers like to have some items positively scored, some items negatively scored, just as an attention check to make sure that, participants, like an undergrad, just not, 7 or 6, right? Just to hurry up and get credit. Okay. Or 1. Okay. To make sure that, okay, these students are really paying attention because they're marking 6 for the positively scored items and 1 on the negatively scored items, thereby consistently showing, for example, that this type of phenomenon has a wide extent of harm. Okay. Higher scores indicate perceptions of broad societal impact, whereas lower scores indicate perceptions of narrow societal impact. Another thing that we wanted to measure, or that was measured in this article, was retributive, right? Justice responses. Okay, retribution, right? We're seeing like how much retribution is appropriate here. Okay, in other words, we want to ask, based on these different types of insults, right? The insult based on weight, the insult based on ethnic status, Asian American or African American. We want to ask how much punishment is deserving for these different scenarios or conditions. Okay, and we're going to measure the appropriate level of punishment, or the appropriate justice response here, by using a single item. Okay, so here Boakman and Liu just used a single item to measure this justice response. Okay, and it was just a question that asked participants to rate how severely the insulting person should be punished on a scale from 0 for least severe to 100 for most severe. Okay, and take a moment to do this yourself. Think about it. The 3 different conditions, which one do you think is most severe? And which one do you think is least severe? How would you rate these different scenarios on a scale from 0 to 100 based on their severity? Okay. All right. We have one more thing to measure here, and that's collective self-esteem and social identification. Another thing that we want to aim to understand in this article is, do individuals that more strongly identify with their ethnic group, like maybe I'm like really proud of being an Asian American, maybe I strongly identify with that, okay, or maybe I don't, right? Maybe I weakly identify with it, like, yeah, I'm Asian, but not a big deal, right? So you can see that individuals may vary in the extent to which they identify with their ethnic group labels, okay? And what we're going to do here is measure that. The reason why we want to measure that is, by hypothesis, it may be a factor, right, in how offensive we perceive a slur to be, right? One hypothesis would be, perhaps if I more strongly identify as an Asian American, I might find that condition where someone is insulting Asian Americans with the C slur, like the C word, I might find that to be more offensive. Whereas if I less strongly identify with that group, I might see it as less offensive. Okay, or at least that's a hypothesis. Another possibility is that the level of my identification with that group may play no impact, right? Maybe it doesn't matter, right? So this is one thing that we aim to investigate in this article, is, does that level of social identification impact the perceived offensiveness or inappropriateness, right, of these actions, of these different behaviors. This scale, the scale used to measure collective self-esteem and social identification, is the collective self-esteem scale. And we can see that the scale is available here for you, okay, by Crocker and Lieutenant, 1990, Collective Self-Esteem and In-Group Bias, published in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology. Okay, so if you wanted to utilize a measure in your study for social identification, you could use this measuring tool, the scale, okay. This scale is composed of 16 items, okay, so just questions or statements that you can agree or disagree with. And these items were on a scale from 1 to 7, completely disagree, which is 1, or 7, completely agree. This scale is composed of 4 subscales that are in turn composed of 4 items each. Okay, the subscales include the following: public collective self-esteem, private collective self-esteem, identification importance, and membership esteem. Okay. And a sample item to measure for public collective self-esteem is this, quote, in general, others respect the ethnic group that I am a member of. Do you completely disagree? 1, or do you completely agree? 7. And you just have to answer on that scale where you are from 1 to 7. Okay, and that measures your public collective self-esteem. A sample item to measure private collective self-esteem is the following, quote, I often regret that I belong to the ethnic group I do belong to. An example of a sample item to measure identification importance is, quote, overall, my ethnic group has very little to do with how I feel about myself. And finally, a sample item to measure an individual's membership esteem is, quote, I am a worthy member of the ethnic group I belong to. Okay. And those are just sample items that are used to measure the extent to which a participant has membership esteem, finds it important to identify as a group member, as well as measurements for private and public collective self-esteem. Okay, so now that we have our research questions, we have our methodology, now let's go ahead and look at the results. Okay, what did the participants provide? Right, what was sort of the outcomes that their participants provided? Yeah, in other words, did the students in this study, did they find ethnic insults to be worse, equivalent, or not as bad as individual level insults, right? Individual and group-based insults. Which one's worse? And let's see how the participants responded. So participants evaluated degrading speech directed at ethnic characteristics as having significantly greater societal impact than speech directed at an individual characteristic. Okay, so slurs that target individuals based on their ethnic status as Asian American and African American were rated as significantly worse, as having significantly greater societal impact than degrading speech or insults that are directed at individual level characteristics, such as an individual's overweight status. Okay, interesting. Okay, and here we see that degrading speech is rated differently based on whether it's directed at targets based on their Asian American ethnic identity, based on their African American ethnic identity, or based on their overweight status and identity. Okay, and here we see that the rating right here for degrading speech directed at targets based on their Asian American status or identity is 4.78. Okay, the rating for degrading speech directed at targets based on their African American status or identity is 4.76. And the rating for degrading speech directed at targets based on their overweight status or identity is 4.13. Okay, and we see that the rating for degrading speech directed at targets based on their overweight status or identity right here is significantly lower than these results right here. 4.13 is significantly lower than 4.76 and 4.78. Okay, so we see that that's a statistically significant result. Okay, and that shows us that something about ethnic degrading speech that targets individuals based on their membership in a group, that's judged to have a more harmful, greater societal impact than degrading speech directed at a target based on their individual weight. Okay. And of course, this is just the result from this study. You might question this or want to run another study to figure out why this is the case, or, just to further interrogate this issue. Okay. But this is one of the findings. Participants also recommended more severe punishment for hate speech directed at ethnicity rather than insults directed at someone's overweight status. Okay. So participants not only rated these as having larger societal impact, but also that they're deserving of more punishment, more severe punishment. Okay. And those are conceptually distinct things, although of course they could be related, right? If something has greater societal impact in a negative way, then it makes sense that we should apply more severe punishment for those behaviors. Okay, so they're related. And here we see the recommendations for severe punishment based on insults that target individuals based on their ethnic status as Asian American, African American, and also punishment for degrading speech that targets individuals based on their individual overweight status. And here we see that the rating for punishment, for how much punishment should be appropriate for an individual that hurls weight-based insult, an individual level insult, was scored 71. Okay. And here we see that the punishment for insults based on ethnic status, right, a group label or a group level status, we see that punishment for those types of insults are significantly higher, right? 76.2 as opposed to 71. Okay. And the difference between 71 and 76.2 is statistically significant. Okay. So just like we see up here, that this, right, the finding for individual level insults is different than the finding for group-based slurs. Here we see that similarly, the amount of punishment appropriate for individual level insults is different than the appropriate level of punishment for using group-based insults or slurs. Okay. Also, participants with high membership esteem punished Asian hate speech more severely than participants with low membership esteem. Okay, so interestingly enough, we see that, you know, if I strongly identify with being an Asian American, then I'm going to punish those that use Asian American slurs, right, against Asian Americans. I'm going to punish them even more than if I was if I less strongly identified as an Asian American. Okay. So, and here we see that the recommendations for severe punishment based on how you scored on this collective self-esteem scale, we see that, students with high membership esteem, like I'm really an Asian American, rated degrading speech directed at Asian Americans 80.4. And students with low membership esteem, sorry, I copied and pasted and I forgot to swap out high with low, but this should say students with low membership esteem as Asian Americans. So I don't really identify as an Asian American. Those individuals rated degrading speech directed at Asian Americans 72.0. Okay, so the difference between 80.4 and 72 is statistically significant. Okay, so we see that this is a significant finding. Okay, that there's an influence on how strongly I identify with my group, right? Based on that, that's going to influence how much punishment someone who slurs my group, how much punishment they should receive, okay, for slurring my group. Okay, so interesting, right? We're getting some very interesting findings. And again, what we want to do as slur scholars, as scholars that are studying slurs and stereotypes, what we want to do is sort of collect a list of findings, right? Because this is going to help us build an accurate model or theory, right? What we want to do is our theory or model shouldn't just explain like one unidimensional aspect or facet of slurs, like slurs just hurt people and that's it, right? Like that's not a nuanced and compelling theory of slurs. What we want to do is sort of collect data about slurs, like, oh, interesting, right? Slurs have an in-group and an out-group use. slurs, the offensiveness of a slur depends on how strongly a target, right, identifies with the group or not, right? Also, we see that based on whether the slur, like the language, is at an individual or group level, that also impacts the perceived offensiveness of that word, right? What we're doing is we're accumulating lots of interesting, relevant, yet different findings, and an excellent comprehensive theory of slurs should be able to account or accommodate all these different findings, okay, and further predict what we would find in like our next study that we haven't yet done, okay. All right, so these are some interesting results from experiment 1. Now let's look at experiment 2. Okay, and here, what we're going to do in experiment 2 is now consider the use of slurs in comparison to petty theft. Okay, so in the first experiment, we didn't consider slurs linguistic offense. We didn't consider that with respect to non-linguistic offense, like petty theft, right? Which is a sort of like social offense, but a non-linguistic form. Okay, so now what we want to do in experiment 2 is investigate this research question, right? Like, how does linguistic offense relate, or stand in relation to non-linguistic offense? Which one's more offensive? What do people think about these different kinds of offense? Once again, this study's focusing on Asian American students. Okay, so all Asian American students, average age for the second study, it's a similar age group, around 20, but here it's 21.21. And again, the demographic is somewhat similar. Here we have 51% females. Okay, so it's a little bit more split down the middle here than in the first study, which was predominantly, or at least mostly, females. I think it was like 75% females. Okay. Again, in this study, participants were presented with different scenarios. The scenarios were designed to vary the nature of offense occurring in a public setting. And the scenarios that we have is a petty theft scenario, and then a scenario where there's going to be an insult or a slur used to target an Asian American and an African American. Okay. So here's the mock scenario that was created for the participants. Okay. This scenario is described 2 people standing in line at a store, this time at a campus. The target of the offense delays the line by using an ATM card and getting $10 cash back from her purchase. A man waiting in line behind her becomes impatient and angry and grumbles that she should be more prepared when she shops. The target is obviously upset by this behavior and hurriedly walks off with her purchase. So now our different conditions. Okay, we have a petty theft condition and then 2 hate speech conditions. One hate speech condition targeting Asian American identity, the other hate speech condition targeting African American identity. Okay. In the petty theft condition, she forgets the $10 and the man quickly pockets the money before anyone notices. Okay, so notice that where this scenario just left off, right, before we split into the petty theft and hate speech conditions, we saw that the woman that purchased, that made a purchase at the bookstore on campus and got $10 cash back, here in the petty theft condition, she forgot the $10 cash back. So she got $10 cash back, but she forgot it because she left in a hurry, right? She was annoyed and she accidentally left the $10 on the counter. And then so in the petty theft condition, the guy behind her that was annoyed, he grabbed the money, right? And just kept it instead of telling her or returning the money. Okay, so that's the petty theft scenario. Now the hate speech scenarios or conditions. Here, the individual, she doesn't forget the $10 this time. She takes the money, right? And before she walks off, though, the man loudly shouts at her. So instead of the man taking her money, in these cases, he's going to say something to her instead of taking the money. Okay. Here in the ethnic, in the hate speech condition for Asian Americans, right, targeting that ethnicity, here's the scenario. The man loudly shouts, effing C word. You mongrel people are always messing things up for everyone. You are all inferior and stupid. You can't even remember to bring money to the, GD store. You should all just go back to where you came from. Okay. The target of the hate speech is then described as humiliated and walks away with her head down. Okay. In the hate speech condition that targets African Americans, it's identical, right? Except for here we've swapped out the C word that targets Asian Americans and we've replaced it with the N word that targets African Americans. Okay. So again, we want to use the same sort of scenario, but just change the slur and the target group. Okay. And now what we want to do is, now that we have scenarios and our participants are going to respond to these different scenarios, and by hypothesis, they'll respond slightly differently to these scenarios. Again, we need measuring tools to measure how much they respond to these different scenarios, right? We want to quantify their responses. So what we'll use is the same measurements, right? We're going to use this article includes 2 studies, experiment 1, experiment 2, right? So what we can do is just borrow the same measures from experiment 1 for experiment 2. Okay. So just like what's going on in the single article, if we wanted to do another article, what we might do, right? For example, some of my students have reached out about collaborating on papers, and I'm, of course, super excited and down to do that. What we might do then is replicate and extend this work, right? We might want to come up in our paper 2 additional experiments that are similar to, that's very similar to this, but will use the same measures, but for a different, like, target group, for example, or using a different type of slur, for example. Or maybe we want to keep everything, like we want to keep the target groups and the slurs, but maybe we're just not happy with the scenarios for whatever reason, right? Like you might think, you know what, I could probably create a more convincing scenario, which may further highlight the results, right? You might be able to create a more convincing stimulus set, right? So there may be multiple reasons or motivations for extending this type of work. Okay, so no surprises here. If we want to measure the extent of harm, we're going to use the societal impact scale from Boakman's dissertation in 1996. If we want to measure justice responses, we can measure that with several items. Okay, in this experiment 2, Boakman and Liu used 2 items. The first item asked participants to rate the severity of a recommended punishment. Okay, so after you read different scenarios, like the petty theft scenario or the hate speech scenario, I might ask you, how would you rate the punishment for those behaviors? Okay. The second measurement for justice response asked participants to indicate their level of support for a university suspension policy for people who have behaved the antisocial way described in the scenario, by making a rating on a 1 to 7 scale, where 1 represents very strongly against and 7 represents very strongly in favor for. Okay. And here, the reason why we sometimes want to use multiple items or multiple questions, right, is like just to make sure that in general we're capturing the phenomenon or the responses that we want, right? If all my measures were only single item, like there may be something idiosyncratic about the way I worded that item, right, that might push the results in a particular way, right? So by having measures with multiple items, like 4 items, 16 items, right, by having multiple items that have different questions or different statements with different wordings and different ratings, like either positively or negatively scored, right? We can take steps to make sure that the results we're getting are not idiosyncratic due to the nature of our measures. Okay, so that's why we have a couple measures here, just to make sure that we want to see, on the one hand, are students recommending severe punishment for example, insults for the hate speech condition? And then also, are they also recommending that they're strongly in favor for a suspension policy from the university for engaging in those behaviors, right? And if our studies are on the right track, like those two measures should be related, and we should see some agreement, right, between those items. Okay, we should see that hate speech is rated as deserving severe punishment, but then also in this slightly differently worded question, like how strongly do you agree with a university policy for suspending students? They should also rate that strongly. Okay, if for whatever reason students were rating these very differently, that would give us pause to reevaluate how we've created our measures. Like maybe the wording of our scales or items, maybe we made a mistake, right? Maybe we forgot to remove a negative, or we just need to rethink about the optimal way or an improved way of rephrasing our items. Okay. So higher scores on these items indicate a more punitive response, whereas lower scores on items indicate a less punitive response. Also in this study and experiment 2, the emotional responses of participants were measured. And the way that they measured participants' emotional responses is that they had participants rate a list of emotions or their feelings. Okay, so for example, they had to rate a list of feelings and give a sense of how they're feeling right now. And the 4 emotions were anger, sadness, outrage, and fear. Okay, so after you read the scenario, like a hate speech scenario that targets Asian Americans, then I ask you, how much anger do you feel right now? Rate that on a scale from 1 to 9, where 1 indicates not angry at all, whereas 9 indicates very angry. Okay, and then I'll ask, okay, now how much sadness do you feel? Right, and then you rate on a scale from 1 to 9. How much outrage do you feel? Scale 1 to 9. How much fear do you feel? Scale 1 to 9. Okay, and this is going to be how we measure the participants' emotional responses to these different scenarios: petty theft and hate speech towards Asian Americans and African Americans. And once again, we're going to measure self-esteem, right? This has to do with how strongly I identify as an Asian American, and if that impacts my rating of the offensiveness of the hate speech, or on the degree of punishments that the degree of punishment that's deserving of individuals that engage in hate speech, right? If I want to measure that, the degree of my identification with my in-group, we can use this collective self-esteem scale. All right, now let's look at our results. Okay, what are the results from experiment 2? Well, participants rated hate speech directed at an Asian American and hate speech directed at an African American as having significantly greater societal impact than petty theft. Okay, so here we're looking at 3 things, right? Petty theft, hate speech against Asians, hate speech against Asian Americans, hate speech against African Americans. Okay, and here the first interesting finding is that the hate speech is separated from the petty theft. Okay, hate speech for Asian Americans and African Americans is rated as having significantly greater societal impact than petty theft. Okay. Participants rated hate speech as deserving significantly more severe punishment than petty theft. Okay, and as I mentioned, this makes sense, right? That if you think that hate speech has a greater societal impact than petty theft, then it makes sense that you would rate hate speech as also deserving more severe punishment than petty theft. And that finding, that was found here in experiment 2. Okay. Emotional responses to reading the hate speech accounts were more extreme than responses following the petty theft scenario. And we'll see that in the figure. This was true of all the emotional measures taken, including outrage, anger, fear, and sadness. Okay, so the hate speech elicits stronger emotional reactions, all emotions, when compared to petty theft. Okay, petty theft, at least the Asian American students in this study, right, compared to the hate speech, petty theft wasn't as big of a deal. And here, interestingly enough, the study found that the hate speech scenarios did not differ significantly from each other. Okay, although as we look in the figure, we'll see that in the figure we see a slight difference. And I'll explain why this is interesting to note, even though it's not a statistically significant finding. Okay, and the purpose of this is just to help you think about how we use individual articles to think about future work. Okay, how we essentially chew on the results from this study and what we know from previous studies, and how we can use that to think about what might be an interesting and valuable future study. Okay. All right, so now let's go ahead and look at the figure. And we're almost done. Okay. So this figure is pretty straightforward. We see on the x-axis, we have petty theft, African American, Asian American conditions. Okay. On the x-axis. On the y-axis, or on the vertical axis, right, we have the ratings from 0, 1, 2, 3, and so on all the way up. Okay. And here you might have to zoom in or just pay careful attention. We see that there's different symbols that stand for outrage, anger, fear, and sadness. Okay. And here we see that this is right here. We're just going to practice reading this figure together. For those of us that are maybe new to cognitive science and psychology, we can see here, right? We're asked, what emotion does this stand for? Right? And we see that this is a triangle. We look over here, that stands for fear. Okay, so, if we're just practicing reading the figures together, we can ask each other just some fun questions. Like in the petty theft condition, what was the weakest emotional response, right? And we see that the emotional response that was least forcefully indicated was fear. Okay. And then we could ask that also for these other conditions, right? What was sort of like the emotion that was least strongly elicited, right? And we see that in the African American condition, fear. In the Asian American condition, fear. Okay, and this is just practicing reading, looking at this figure. We could also ask, what's the strongest emotional response to these 3 different conditions? Okay, and so we look up here, we see that this is a square. Okay, and we look over here, what's a square? It's anger. Okay, and so in the petty theft condition, we see that the strongest emotional response to the petty theft was anger. Okay, and then we can look in the African American condition. What's the strongest emotional response to hate speech directed towards African Americans? We see that it's also anger. Okay, and then finally, we can look at the condition involving hate speech directed at Asian Americans, and we see that the strongest of the 4 emotions that were elicited in this condition was also anger. Okay, and in future work, we might want to include more emotions or different attitudes, right? We might ask, right, swapping these emotions out with other emotions or other attitudes, we might ask how participants respond to these varying conditions. Okay, we could also swap out these conditions. Maybe instead of petty theft, we want it to be like, Grand Theft Auto, or something more significant, right? Like manslaughter, right? Or something, we might just tinker with these conditions to find different results, like making this more or less severe. Okay. All right. Let me go ahead and just read the main results from this figure, and then I'll talk about how we might think about these results as motivation for future work. So we see that hate speech scenarios, these two scenarios right here, hate speech directed towards African Americans and hate speech directed towards Asian Americans, these two scenarios evoke significantly higher levels of all emotions when compared to this scenario, the petty theft scenario. Okay. And that just means if we compare these numbers, right, this is about 3, this is a little bit over 2. The difference between 2 and 3 is a statistically significant result here. Okay. Also, in this article, they found that hate speech scenarios did not differ significantly from each other. Okay. So here we see that although these two compared to this is a significant difference, right? Hate speech versus petty theft, we see a significant difference. Now, if we just zoom in between these two conditions, right? Hate speech directed towards African Americans and hate speech directed towards Asian Americans, the results from this article suggest that the difference here is not statistically significant. So, for example, what does that mean? Well, although the difference between like 2 and 3 is statistically significant, the difference between 3 and a little bit more than 3, right, in the African American and Asian American condition is not statistically significant, okay? Or at least that's the result from this article, okay? Similarly, right, they found that this right here, this difference is not statistically significant. This difference here is not statistically significant. And this difference here is not statistically significant. Okay, so the main take-home point here is that based on this study, we see that there's a clear distinction between when we compare hate speech versus non-hate speech. For example, petty theft. That there's a clear distinction there. Okay, excuse me. But we don't yet have a clear statistically significant distinction between hate speech, like how bad hate speech is, like how bad, how much punishment, right? Or the emotional reaction, right? Here, this is rating the emotional reaction. Here we're saying that the emotional reaction from Asian Americans to hate speech that targets Asian Americans and hate speech that targets African Americans, there's not a statistically significant difference there. Okay. All right. Now, what I want to say is, although in terms of statistical significance, that's the result from this article. And we need to just appreciate the result here. Okay. So, all right, cool. That's the finding from this article. Okay. However, we have things to think about now, right? And this is sort of like the thought process when we're engaging in work is, on the one hand, this is an interesting result and it's consistent with our hypotheses, right? We thought that insults that target ethnic status may be more offensive than insults that target individuals, okay? Also, we thought that hate speech may be more offensive by hypothesis than petty theft, okay? At least these are hypotheses that these researchers had, and the results seem to be consistent with their hypotheses, okay? However, notice that from some other work that we've read, right? Work on the N-word, for example, that the N-word is, some scholars have suggested that the N-word is the most offensive slur, right? More so than other slurs, right? So there we see that some people have claimed, right, that that there should be a difference here, right, between the emotional response to hate speech directed at Asian Americans and the emotional response directed at the emotional response to hate speech directed at African Americans, right? In other words, those scholars that have claimed that the N-word is the most offensive word in the English language. What they're saying is that in terms of emotional reactions, hate speech directed towards African Americans should be significantly higher than hate speech directed towards Asian Americans, right? So in some other work based on the hypothesis of other research, we should see a statistically significant result here, or at least that might be our hypothesis, right? Also, in some other work, we've seen that um, the offensiveness of slurs is going to be based on the target group. Okay. So for example, the target group status, right? The Whether the target group is more powerful or less powerful, right? Remember, we saw that from work by Galinsky and colleagues on the reappropriation of slurs, right? We saw that one thing that influences the offensiveness of slurs is how powerful the group is, right? And so we might predict based on the power of African Americans and Asian Americans that there would also be a statistically significant result if these two groups differ in their power. Okay, if African Americans and Asian Americans differ in their power, then we should also find a statistically significant difference in emotional responses to hate speech directed at Asian Americans and hate speech directed towards African Americans. Okay, so what I'm trying to say here is based on some other research, and here I just mentioned two other works, but there's other work as well that suggests this, right? What we want to do here, right, is ask. And further, not only do we have this idea from other work, but if we look at this figure, although this difference is not statistically significant, it looks like it's approaching statistical significance, right? Like here, right, and for fear, we see that there isn't much of a difference between African Americans and Asian Americans, right? But when we look at anger, the difference is larger, right? So what we may do in like a future study, for example, is replicate this study, but change the measure for the emotional response. And we might find that in a future study, our results are now statistically significant and not just approaching statistical significance. Okay. So what I'm saying here is just because a finding is not reported as statistically significant, that doesn't mean it's not worth thinking about and chewing on for a moment, right? Because we may, like, if we modify the scenario, so maybe if we provide a cleaner scenarios, right, that provide clearer distinctions, right? And also if we modify the measures, like maybe if I remove fear and just remove fear and just focus on anger, right? By providing more clear scenarios with clearer distinctions and also modifying the measures used, like by focusing only on anger, I might find that now I have a statistically significant difference between hate speech directed at African Americans and hate speech directed at Asian Americans. Okay. In other words, by modifying the scenarios and measures, what is statistically insignificant but approaching significance in this figure, we might be able to further zoom in and get a cleaner result here. Okay. And that's why I wanted you to practice not just reading the article. Like if you read the article, you're going to just think that, okay, there is no statistically significant difference between hate speech towards African Americans and hate speech towards Asian Americans, right? If you just read the article, that might be your take-home message. But I want you to not just leave with results, but I want you to leave with productive thoughts for research. And I think that looking at this figure can be helpful in that sense, right? Because you're seeing, for all four emotions, we're going in a particular direction here, slightly uphill. Whereas if, in other work where this is really, in other work, we just might see like, okay, well, for anger, it's like this, but for fear, it's like this. And for outrage, it's like this, right? In that case, it would be more clear that there's no systematic relationship between emotional responses between hate speech directed at African Americans and emotional responses to hate speech directed towards Asian Americans. Okay. So this is how we can chew on this figure and use it to think about future work. And in future work, we might find that there is no distinction, right? Maybe it's true that if we keep measuring different students, they think that hate speech directed towards African Americans and hate speech directed towards Asian Americans are all equally they yield the same emotional responses, right? Well, that would be also a very interesting result, because then that may suggest that our responses to the N-word may be changing, right? Whereas previous scholars have suggested that it's the most offensive form of hate speech, maybe these new results can question some of those previous points that were made in earlier work, right? And this might show that either that earlier work um, was off methodologically, right? Maybe there was something that could have been improved in that previous study, right? Or maybe times have changed, right? Like, this is one of the cool things and interesting things about hate speech and just slang and taboo words, is that work that was done 10 years ago may not hold anymore, right? As the valence, right? Positive, negative, as well as the semantic content, the meaning of our words change over time. This calls on us to redo studies to make sure that our results still maintain and still hold. Okay. All right. So I just want to mention that in this case, and a hypothesis may be that the student responses to hate speech in this study may be particularly high, right? Because the students that participated were all Asian Americans, right? If in the subsequent study, we also swapped out participants, so that way they were all African Americans instead of Asian Americans, we may see these results change as well, right? We may see that ratings here go higher, right? Because now African American students are the target group, right? This slur is targeting them. We may see that their emotional response ratings are higher, and the ratings for their emotional responses to hate speech that targets Asian Americans may be lower, right? So we may get more of like a peak here, where it's peaking at Asian Americans. Okay, this study we may have particularly high emotional responses here, right? Even looking a little bit higher than African Americans in this figure, right? Looking at the figure, we might have particularly high emotional responses for Asian Americans because our participants in this study were Asian Americans, right? And the hate speech directed at Asian Americans is targeting them in this study. Okay, so we might see these particularly high for Asian American participants, but if we swap out African American participants for Asian American participants, these emotional ratings may go down and these emotional ratings may go up. Okay. All right. So general discussion. Study 1 showed that Asian American students viewed insults directed at group characteristics as unique from insults directed at individual characteristics. So this gives us some suggestion that we should classify group-based insults as distinct from individual level insults, right? If someone uses the N-word, that's different and distinct from if someone calls someone else overweight, or an insult based on overweight status, or at least that's the argument from this research. Study 2 showed that Asian American students view hate speech as a more serious crime than petty theft. And those were the main points from this article. Okay. Questions though, because my goal for you in this course is not just to fill you with facts, right? Like here's a fact, but rather to help you develop skills and become practicing cognitive scientists, right? Eventually, after you master the methods, you should be able to ditch me and do this work on your own. Okay. So here's some questions that I want you to think about from this work. Okay. What is the most significant or interesting result from this study? What do you think is most significant or interesting? How would you replicate and extend this study? Would you change the scenarios? Would you change some of the emotions measured? Would you use different participants? How would you, based off of this work, right, and what was done in this work, how would you develop a new study based on this work? Okay. And it's very important that we engage in science in this way, right? What we don't want to do as scientists, okay, is we don't want to just come up with a new study off the top of our head. Okay. This happens a lot from new students, right? If you don't have much experience, sometimes you just sort of have an idea like, I wonder how colors affect mood, right? Like that's just a random thought that I had, right? And I might just like think of a study right now on how I might test whether color affects mood. Okay, well, maybe if I wear red color glasses all day and then rate on a scale like how happy or sad I am, that could be one condition, and another condition will be I wear blue glasses all day, and then I'll rate on a scale how happy or sad I am, and then I could see whether um, the color of my glasses, right, impacts my mood. Okay, whether colors impact my mood. That might be one study that I just randomly think of. However, I don't want you to proceed in that manner as a scientist, right? Although that might be a fun thing to do as a weekend project, right? And something that we can engage in together as a fun activity, it doesn't yet constitute a scientific investigation, okay? Because what we need to do is situate our work within the context of existing work, okay? And what I did not do just now, as I just randomly thought up an interesting question and a way to study that question, what I didn't do there is contextualize that research question and my method in the context of existing work. Okay. In other words, someone may have already done that study, right? So if, Bob from Berkeley already did that study, well, then I can't propose that as a new study that I want to do because it's already been done, right? You might Google, how does color perception influence mood? And boom, like Bob maybe just published that study. Or maybe he published it 10 years ago and that article has been cited 5,000 times, right? Well, you're not contributing to the literature by doing a study that has already been done and that's already well cited by 5,000 other publications, right? So that highlights the importance of us contextualizing our work. Okay, one, it's to make sure that the work hasn't already been done before. Two, it helps us understand how our project fits within the research of other colleagues and other scholars. Okay, if you don't read any work in cognitive science, right? If you didn't read this article by Bookman and Liu, you didn't read the article by Galinsky and colleagues, you didn't read the article by Raman, you didn't read the work by Randall Kennedy and Jabari Assim, well, then sure, you can do a study on hate speech, but you're not going to have a great understanding of how it fits within the context of existing work, right? And on the one hand, you won't be able to understand whether what you're doing is original, but at a more fine-grained level, you also won't be able to discuss in detail like how your work relates to other work, right? Professional in this field is not just going to be able to do a study, right? But is going to be able to discuss how their study offers a novel contribution to the field that was not yet that had not yet been investigated, right? So I can say, my article makes an important contribution to the field because whereas Galinsky and colleagues focused on these slurs, in this article, I focus on different slurs that have not yet been investigated, right? And you can say things like that, which really show your level of professionalism and that you're a master of this field, okay? And that's how you're going to publish a paper, by drawing upon methods from existing work, contextualizing your research within the context of existing work, then discussing your results, like what does your study show, and also contextualizing your results within the context of existing work. Okay, previous work has never investigated this. This article is the first to investigate this. This is my new result, my novel result. Okay, and this is how my novel result contributes to the field and makes a novel, important contribution to the field of cognitive science. Okay. So we always want to be thinking of how can we replicate and extend our work. In order to do that, we need to read a sufficient amount of literature in the field. Okay. Also, another question, in what ways are the results from this study similar to or consistent with the results from other research? We want to just not understand the results from this study, but we want to understand the results in the context of other results. Are we starting to see a picture painted here? Or is there something inconsistent when we compare this data with other data, right? Like, is the work from Galinsky and colleagues, is it starting to tell a consistent picture with this work? Or are they at opposite ends with each other, right? And either way, like as scientists, it doesn't really matter to us, right? Like, I don't have any like stake in the game. Like I'm not betting or wagering on which theory is true, right? We're just trying to understand what the facts are, right? And so what this will motivate us to do, on the one hand, if we're starting to see a consistent picture painted, then we need to turn out more studies to flesh out the details of that picture, right? We're starting to see puzzle pieces lie together. We need to start laying down more pieces to that puzzle. Okay. On the other hand, if we see inconsistencies, right, then what we need to do now is start testing theories against each other, right? Like theory A should predict this, whereas theory B, which is if it's inconsistent, it should predict something different, right? And now what we can do is think about what are the different predictions from these different theories, right? What do these different theories predict? And we try to find a way to test conduct an experiment that will test how participants respond, right? If their responses are more in line with theory A or more in line with inconsistent theory B, right? And so you see that either way, based on what we find from the literature, we can either use that to produce a new study to build a consistent picture, or we can put inconsistent pictures against each other and think about which one a new study would support and which one a new study would challenge. Okay. Another question is, in what ways are the results from this study different from or inconsistent with the results from other research? And finally, what are some additional research questions that this article raises for you, right? Thinking about this article, what other questions came to mind when you read this article? What other questions came to mind when you were listening to this lecture? I recommend that you write down all those questions as you're watching the lecture, as you're reading through the article. I recommend that you have a scratch paper and you write down all your questions. Oftentimes, this will be highly fruitful for you in writing your papers or coming up with new avenues of research. Okay, I can't tell you. So just as a general method, every article I read, I write in the margins. Like I don't even begin reading unless I have a writing tool in hand. Okay, so this highlights the fact that reading is always active. Listening to lectures, watching lectures is always something that you do and not something that's done to you passively, right? You need to do this. Ask questions as you read, right? So I'm always writing questions in my books. Sometimes I have multiple books, right? Because I've written so many questions in the margins, okay? So write questions in the margins, what's going on with this result? This doesn't seem right? This is inconsistent with this other thing. Or, wow, this is an amazing finding. How may I substitute like this stimulus with something different, right? Make use of the margins and your notepad as you're reading, as you're watching lectures, because then what you can do is then take some time, like maybe on the weekend, to just go spend time with your notebook, right? Like what I like to do is take a notebook to the park or to the coffee shop and just sort of get in the zone and just sort of think about my thoughts, right? Like, what were the thoughts that I had for this week about these articles, right? And that can be very helpful in you preparing a new research project, a new paper. Okay, I have an infinite number of projects to engage in because there's so many articles with notes in the margins. I just have to pick it up and continue working from those notes. Okay. And finally, just some thoughts, closing thoughts for today. So, one of our main goals when reading research articles is to understand the purpose, methods, and results. Right. So, for example, after you read each article, like this article by Bookman and Liu, you should ask yourself, what was the main point or purpose of this article? Right? Why did they conduct this study in the first place? Make sure that you're clear on the point or purpose of an article. Okay. Also, what methods were used in this article to investigate that purpose or point, that research question? And then finally, what are the main results? When you're reading research articles, experimental research articles in psychology and cognitive science, you should have an answer to these three questions before you put the article down. Okay, what was the point of the article? They wanted to investigate whether insults that were directed at individual status differed from insults that were directed at ethnic status. They also wanted to see whether there was more punishment deserving for one over the other. Okay, cool. I'm clear on the point or purpose of the research. What methods were used? Okay, and here you can just sort of like make sure you understand the types of scales that were used. You know, okay, scales, emotional rating scales, collective self-esteem scale, societal impact scale. Okay, also, it would be cool to have in mind like the specific scales that were used. Okay, and also importantly, make sure that before you put the article away, that you're clear on what the results were, right? Usually, your friends and classmates will ask, hey, what was the main result from this article, right? So you should be able to explain, this article found this to be the case, okay? That hate speech directed at ethnic status was rated as more deserving of punishment than petty theft, for example, okay? But importantly, right, and I want to emphasize this, especially for my newer students, our goal in college and especially in graduate school is not just to memorize facts, right? Like the most important thing is not to memorize the facts from this study, although it's important, right? I want you to understand the article and retain knowledge of this article, right? What they did and what they found, right? So that's important in terms of like reading comprehension, okay? But I don't want you to take this as sort of like uh, the final result, and therefore these issues no longer need investigation. Okay, that's not what we're doing in college. Like you might think, well, 2 + 2 = 4. And when you learn addition, the goal is to memorize that fact, right? We're not doing the same thing with empirical research here. We're not saying, well, slurs are more offensive than petty speech. End of story, right? I don't want you to just memorize facts. We're trying to memorize facts for a larger purpose, right? And that's so that way we can understand how to engage in original research, how to be cognitive scientists, and not just memorize results from cognitive science articles, okay? So another important goal for today when you read each article, right, is to raise questions and aim to understand the limitations of this research, okay? And by limitations, this doesn't necessarily mean something's wrong with the article or that it's a bad article, okay? Necessarily because each research project has a specific scope and focus that necessarily involves limitations, right? Just like when I'm focusing on playing the saxophone, I'm focusing on a specific activity, right? I'm limited to attending to other things, okay? So by engaging in a specific thing, we're necessarily limited, and that's okay. We just want to be clear on what our focus is and also clear on what our limitations are, right? We just want to be very clear and articulate this in our articles to the greatest extent possible. Okay, excuse me. So a great article would say something like, in the discussion at the end, the focus of this article was so-and-so, right? The results were so-and-so. These results are important or contribute to the literature because of so-and-so, right? These results contribute to the literature in X, Y, and Z ways, right? And is an important contribution because of X, Y, and Z reasons. Okay. However, this research also has its necessary limitations. So, for example, in this article, we focused on Asian American students. However, in future work, we should conduct a similar study, but with African American students, for example, to see if that influences the emotional response ratings that we see from figure 1. Okay, so we see that we are addressing a limitation and not pointing it out to say that this study is horrible, but to clarify how that might contribute to a more nuanced result, and might contribute to our understanding of slurs in the literature. Okay. So by acknowledging or highlighting limitations of our work, this will help us think about developing new studies that can refine and extend research in this area. In other words, our goal as cognitive scientists is not simply to memorize answers for quizzes, but more importantly, our goal is to be able to understand this material sufficiently well so we can replicate and extend this type of original research. Okay. So I hope that this lecture today was helpful for you, both in understanding the article by Bullock and Liu, but also in helping you to appreciate how we make use of these research articles and think about this work so that we can more productively engage in our own original research. Okay. And I want you to attack each article throughout the course in this manner, so that way you can think about developing a nice final paper and final presentation. Okay. And that's going to be sort of like the crowning project for the course, whereas the quizzes, the purpose of the quizzes is just to help you retain enough information that you can provide or prepare an excellent paper and presentation. Okay, so focus on that. It's the most important thing for you, right? Because you can use that paper as you can use the paper from this course as a writing sample for graduate school. You can submit it to a conference or a journal for publication. That paper is something that is usable and valuable for you, whereas just passing quizzes isn't something that you can do something with. Okay, also watching your presentations and reading your papers is my favorite part of the course, because it's where I get to learn more about your specific interests, and I can better understand how you may be able to contribute to the field as cognitive scientists, okay, which is super exciting for me as a professor here at Berkeley. Okay, so thank you so much for your attention today. I hope you have a great day, and I look forward to seeing you tomorrow for our next lecture.